With that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speakers for today's presentation. We're joined by MarkMonitor brand protection experts Nancy Merritt and Zac Wolf. Nancy is a manager of global relationships for MarkMonitor. With a background in client engagement and online IP enforcement and compliance, she's responsible for cultivating relationships across all MarkMonitor brand partners, with a specialized focus on creating collaborative and mutually beneficial relationships with ISPs, marketplaces, law enforcement, social media, and e-commerce platforms to aid in the fight against online infringement. She is also a member of the IACC Regional Internet Committee, focusing primarily on both social media and B2B/B2C task forces. Zac is the Product Marketing Manager for the MarkMonitor Anti-Counterfeiting Solutions. With over 4 years of experience in brand protection, he is focused on building a comprehensive, effective brand protection strategy for global brands in various industries, including technology, apparel, sports, and entertainment. Zac has managed a team of brand protection analysts and has helped establish industry-standard anti-counterfeiting best practices looking across multiple digital channels. Zac holds a Bachelor of Science in Marketing from the University of Idaho and a Master's of Business Administration from Northwest Nazarene University. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Nancy to get us started.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. I'd like to briefly just review the topics we plan to cover in the webinar. First, we're going to take a look at the current global e-commerce landscape, including some of the current stats around online marketplaces. Then we'll share some emerging markets and trends with a deeper look into a couple of specific countries that are expected to have a lot of potential growth and impact. And lastly, we'll review some various enforcement options and special programs and leave you with some best practices and ways you can leverage the information that we've shared. So let's dive right into the current global e-commerce landscape and what we expect to see in the near future. Total online retail sales are expected to double in the next 4 to 5 years. E-commerce will represent 12.5% of all total retail sales in 2020, compared to 7.5% of total retail sales today. We're expected to reach $1.6 trillion in sales in 2016 and $3.5 trillion by the year 2020. So what does that mean for online marketplaces specifically? There are already millions of online retailers across the globe, and it will continue to grow. Of that $3.5 trillion in global e-commerce sales we just mentioned, marketplaces are expected to own almost 40% of that market. And while the well-known marketplaces such as Amazon, Alibaba, and eBay are still expected to dominate that space, there are a lot of other regions and new platforms starting to emerge, and in some places where the growth potential is huge, based on population and penetration of internet usage. In addition, you now have a lot of major brick-and-mortar retailers that are taking advantage of the growth opportunity, such as Sears, Newegg, Blue Fly, and Walmart, who just within the last couple of days announced their purchase of Jet.com for $3.3 billion. So let's take a look at some of the other regions and marketplaces of note. We want to highlight some specific countries that are experiencing a lot of growth in the e-commerce market. In some cases, this can be attributed to areas with huge populations where internet usage and penetration still has a lot of potential. So if we look at Kenya, for example, they have a population of over 47 million, but only 45% of that population is actually using the internet today. Even more staggering for India, where they have only 34.8% internet penetration of a population of 1.3 billion. And interestingly enough, in India, 2 of the top 10 most trafficked sites in that country are actually marketplaces Amazon and Flipkart, respectively. Flipkart even beat out Twitter in terms of traffic in India. So essentially, there are still hundreds of millions of potential internet users in those countries alone. So you can see, looking at this graph, that generally Amazon and eBay are still very relevant, and in most cases, those countries are actually accessing the .com sites of Amazon and eBay versus the in-country ccTLD. The exception is India, where Amazon and eBay both have a presence of a .in, and then in the Philippines, where eBay has a .ph. But otherwise, those countries are actually accessing the content and the information on the .com sites. You'll also notice that OLX has a big presence in several of these locales. In the past, I would say 12 to 18, maybe pushing 24 months, OLX has acquired the 2 largest marketplaces in the Philippines, Sulit and Ios Dito. And then looking at Kenya and Nigeria, Jumia is the #1 most trafficked site in Nigeria and is the #11 most trafficked site in Kenya. The only other site that I want to point out on this graph, it's a bit of an outlier, is Deal Day in Nigeria. So Deal Day is more of like a Groupon site. It's a daily deal site, but it's seeing a lot of growth in Nigeria, so it's something to certainly take note of. We know that there are still IP infringements on platforms like Groupon and those types of sites, and compliance can be, it depends on the area where they're located, but they certainly have become more popular over the past few years. So I'd like to turn things over to my colleague Zac Wolf, who will go a bit more in depth on a couple of specific markets and share emerging trends that we think may be of interest.
Sounds good. Thanks, Nancy. So for the next couple slides, what I really want to focus on is two specific regions. One that is a kind of a new high growth area, and another that is emerging and hasn't had a lot of conversation around it. And so I wanted to make sure that we touch on that, bring that to the forefront, and at least get people thinking about that particular region. So the name of the webinar, of course, is Emerging and Growing Markets, but I think it would be remiss of us to not at least touch on kind of the biggest one and the one that usually gets the most attention, and that's going to be APAC and China. So as you can see here, some stats, 1.4 trillion is going to be the size of APAC commerce by 2020. So in 4 short years, we're looking at $1.4 trillion, which is quite a lot. If you go down to China, right along with India, they're the fastest growing e-commerce market in the world. I think that stat is interesting for a number of reasons. When people think of, China, it's huge, it's established, it's something that in this particular space we run up against every day and we deal with it, but it's also growing. It's the fastest growing e-commerce market in the world right there with India. So you have a huge population base, you've got a huge penetration of the internet, they've got a huge influence, and they're continuing to grow. And then 16% of e-commerce total retail in China compared to a worldwide average of 7%. So really what that stat is going to back up is that second point that, China is huge, China is growing, and it's got a deep penetration. So of that gigantic population, you've got 16% e-commerce total retail in China, and if you take the rest of the globe, you're looking at 7%. So they've got more than double the e-commerce retail right there in China. So really what I wanted to do is highlight, where China sits, where this region in general sits within the larger scope of e-commerce. And now what we're going to transition into is really a discussion about two particular markets. The first market that we're going to touch on is Russia. Really that falls into a growing market. Russia is very established, and you'll see some cool statistics here in just one second. And then we're going to transition into what we've identified as an important emerging market, and that's going to be Africa. So well, with that, I'll continue to go along. So just some stats to kind of highlight and set some context of where Russia exists currently within e-commerce. There's 70 million is the number of internet users in Russia. Those numbers, much like traffic to websites, that sort of thing, are very tough to make sure that they're completely accurate. So that 70 million number, while it's definitely large, we expect that number to actually be higher and continue to grow. 23 billion in estimated online sales for 2016. 23 billion is no small number. So with that particular region, they're doing, you've got a high number of internet users, and you've got a very high number of online sales in 2016. And then really you've got the 11th largest e-commerce market in sales. So in the previous slide, we identified China and India as kind of the big players in the room. But with Russia coming in at 11, that's quite a presence that they have. And here in just a second, I'll get into how, their geolocation and their large presence in online shopping really kind of pairs up with China and how China is able to influence some of that e-commerce. And then 50% growth in 5 years. Revenue is expected to grow over 35 billion in 2020. So you saw previously the statistics about where the APAC region was going to be in total sales, up in the trillions in 2020. But with Russia alone in the e-commerce of 35 billion, that's a sizable chunk. It's certainly something that's going to continue to grow, and it's something that we want to make sure that is kind of a topic in the forefront of your mind. Is China gets a lot of love when it comes to these kind of things, but Russia is continuing to grow. So on this next slide, really the story that needs to be told is China has a huge influence on Russia's e-commerce. So if we take this first chart here on the left, these are going to be the top 10 retail sites in Russia ranked by unique visitors. So if you look, unsurprisingly, number 1 is going to be Alibaba. And number 2, if you're unfamiliar, is Yandex. Yandex is a very popular site within Russia. And then Ozon, M-Video, and down the list. But really the big takeaway there is the number 1 retail site in Russia is actually Alibaba. So as Alibaba continues to grow, and again, they're no stranger to anyone in this space, their influence in the region is continuing to grow as well. So if you take, Yandex, for example, at 9.13, you look at Alibaba at 18.19, Alibaba is getting almost double the traffic of the next largest Russian site. So the Chinese influence on their e-commerce is large. So when you have Russians that are looking to purchase something online, while a lot of them are going to Yandex, the first thought is let's jump on Alibaba. So you've got that big Chinese influence there. If you look at the second chart up on the top right, this is the Russian purchases of Chinese online stores per product category. So there's a number of things that I want to call out in this particular chart that I think are going to be very interesting. So I know we've got a number of folks on the phone that represent a wide variety of different products, different areas, different industries, verticals, all that good stuff. So if we look on the left side, it ranks them in popularity. So we've got clothing and footwear, children's goods, mobile phones, tablets, so you get into the technology space, which is always very interesting. Then you got items for home and garden, which might be a bit of a surprise, but it's up there. And then consumer electronics, and then, of course, down the list. But really the call-out or the highlight there is that a lot of the things that the Russian e-commerce purchaser is buying from these Chinese online stores is very similar to a lot of other regions. They're purchasing clothing, they're purchasing technology and luxury goods, and they're purchasing things for their home. The second call-out will be the arrows on the right side. As you can see, they're all bright red, and they're all trending upward. So if you look clothing and footwear, just to grab one example, 22% growth in that area of Russians purchasing products from Chinese retailers. As you go down the list, you've got 11% growth, 10% growth, 9% growth. You've got a ton of growth in all of these different industries and all these different verticals of Russians going online, doing mobile shopping, and then deciding to purchase those goods from China. And then finally, in the bottom right-hand corner, we've got another chart. This is the estimated shares fulfilled, these are the number of fulfilled orders that come from China and overall e-commerce. So really what these charts are, these two graphs indicate is the number of orders that are fulfilled across the board that are coming into Russia. So in 2013, which I know is a few years ago, you've got around 40%, so you're closing in on half of the amount of goods. But then if you look in 2014, so we're talking just a single year jump, we've added 30%. So around 70% of all goods that are e-commerce purchased that are in Russia are actually being fulfilled in China and coming across the border. So from 2013 to 2014, you've got a 30% jump. So if you kind of extrapolate that out into 2015, 16, and beyond, you can really see that China has quite a large influence on Russian e-commerce. So again, just to tie this particular slide up, Russians they're going to Alibaba as their most popular site. All of the industries that they're purchasing on are trending upwards, and a lot of those industries are very similar to other regions, and the amount of total orders fulfilled that are coming into Russia from China are growing. So some key takeaways. I touched on most of these, but Russia is a growing market with a large presence, and China has a large influence. So one of the things that we wanted to highlight here is really, if you're going to think about China, and that's something that we spend a lot of time thinking about, you want to make sure that you've also got the thought of, where is China influencing? And with their geolocation, the ease of transport, that sort of thing, Russia is a huge influence, and Russia itself has a huge user base. So just an extra thing to consider when you're talking about how to combat China. Where's China's influence going? Russia is certainly there, and something that needs to be considered. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit. We're going to go from a growing market to one that we would consider emerging. So I've been fortunate enough to be in a number of conferences with a number of folks similar to you on the phone, and they really started to ask the question about Africa. It's the second largest continent, it's the second most populated, but when we have these types of discussions and we're talking about, what's the next big thing and what's the emerging trend, it often gets left out of the discussion. So it took some of that really good feedback and did kind of a deep dive on Africa that I want to share with you. I hope some of this information is, if it's new, it's helpful, and it really kickstarts that conversation. It's, that it's past, the U.S., LATAM, China, some of these other places that get a lot of the time and the talking points. Africa is certainly emerging and something that should be considered. So 334 million, the number of internet users in Africa. Nigeria leads the way with 93 million. Then you've got Egypt and Kenya that follow with about 1/3 of that total use. So Nigeria has a large percentage of the top 3 of the total kind of internet penetration of users, and I'll jump into some more specifics on Nigeria here in just a second. 18.7 billion online estimated sales for 2016. That does include the Middle East. Wanted to make sure that we called that out. So you can see that Africa is quickly gaining on Russia and some of these other locations. Not quite there yet, but it's something to make sure that we keep an eye out for. 100% growth in 5 years. The statistics of 100% growth, I think, is pretty eye-opening. If we look back at some of the other slides, definitely nowhere near the total growth in over 5 years. So 35 billion in 2020. If you remember back to the Russia slide, those numbers are going to be fairly comparable. So if we're talking about China and then we're talking about the influence on Russia, we also want to make sure that we've got them in the, sorry, a little bit of a technology glitch there. So we've got them in the forefront as well. And then to call out the Nigeria number, so 65% of Nigerian online users also shop online. So really what that means in the context of some of these other statistics is that Nigeria has the most amount of users, and they've also got well over 50% of those people do online shopping. So just wanted to set some context around Africa, give you some population, who's there, and how much of the growth is really there. So some of the key takeaways for Africa e-commerce, they've got a large population that continues to gain more access. So one of the things that's interesting about Africa is, although they've got the second largest population per continent, the amount of penetration for internet use across the entire continent is still evolving and is still emerging. So there's a lot of high population areas that are looking to gain internet access, or they've got very limited internet access, but Africa is really kind of trying to put in a lot of infrastructure around that. So you've got a large population that is slowly gaining. So if we're looking at Nigeria, for example, they've got 90 million internet users, and some of those other emerging markets, there's other pockets out there that will quickly grow, and then you're looking at an area that can be just as large as any, if not overtake some of the largest areas in the world. Mobile shopping is huge as consumers are becoming more comfortable. So a lot of the online shopping in Africa is done via mobile. They've got some interesting technology that may not be exactly for this webinar, but it's very interesting, how they're able to use various sites on their mobile phones. They're able to purchase, and people are becoming more comfortable with it. One of the things that's interesting about the mobile shopping is that currently in Africa, the exchange of hard currency is still the preferred way. So if you order something online, there's still the idea of a COD or collect on delivery. They exchange hard currency. That is the way that they're most comfortable. And so as more and more people gain access to the internet, as people become more and more comfortable with online shopping via mobile, this idea of using digital currencies that we're very comfortable here with, it becomes more and more penetrated that way. And then barriers of entry that need to be addressed. This is something that I think is a very interesting topic and that needs to be called out. So we've got so Africa is emerging. We've got all of these different parts of the continent becoming more and more comfortable with online shopping. They're becoming more and more comfortable on how you pay for goods. More and more of the continent and different areas are getting internet access. But there's still quite a few barriers of entry that need to be addressed. So one of the more interesting ones is the simple idea of delivery. So if, here in the United States and elsewhere, if you go online, you can go to your favorite e-commerce site, you decide to pick and pay for a good, you pick overnight shipping, maybe you have free 2-day shipping, and then you're pretty confident that it's going to get to you. In Africa, a lot of the infrastructure is still being developed, and so if you pay for a good online and if you don't live in one of the highly concentrated urban areas, it can be challenging for your goods to get delivered to you. So if you're thinking about going online and buying something, the idea that you might never receive it is certainly a barrier of entry that needs to be addressed. The other one is security. And so anytime you have one of these emerging markets, You've got a lot of players that are trying to enter the space. You've got a lot of different marketplaces that Nancy did a great job touching on that are trying to become more and more popular with consumers. So a lot of times you have a bunch of competition and you've got a lot of entrants, and so you want to make sure, or the people are trying to figure out which of these are actually secure. And then with it being kind of a new thing, this online shopping, you've got some security issues with the consumer that are currently needing to be addressed. So now that we've talked about a growing area in Russia, an emerging market in Africa and Nigeria, what we want to do is switch into some emerging trends. So as we talk about these emerging trends, certainly within, the brand protection space, there's always a ton of different things that are happening, and it's something that we find interesting and that we try to stay on top of. These are just a few that we've got a lot of feedback on. These are a few that, that we've seen as we go about, our work that we've seen emerging and that we're currently trying to deal with or build best practices around. This is not meant to be, a comprehensive list of everything that's out there, but some that we thought that were interesting and exciting and we wanted to touch on. So of the emerging trends, these are the three that we highlighted. So mobile-only marketplaces. I'll get into what that means here in just one second, but it's a bit of a departure from the traditional online e-commerce marketplace. Social media and chat apps, the social media part of it is pretty well known, and I think it's been covered in a number of webinars. But the chat apps is something that we want to discuss and kind of how they fit and how they tie together with more traditional social media. And then deep web and the dark web. That's something that's emerging. It's something that we continue to hear more about, and so we wanted to just bring up that topic of conversation. So emerging trends, mobile-only marketplaces. One that we wanted to highlight is a mobile marketplace called Mercari. It's the first Japan startup unicorn. Really, that phrase unicorn just means out of all of the startups, it's kind of one that rose to the top. It's got an over $1 billion valuation, and here recently it just raised another $75 million. So Mercari is one that's on our radar and is on a lot of the radar of the folks that we chat about. So there's 32 million downloads, which is a large amount. You've got 7 million that are U.S.-based, and really when we talk about mobile-only marketplaces, the trend is that it's a departure from traditional e-commerce. So if you talk about traditional e-commerce, we can talk about some of the sites that everyone knows of. You got your Alibabas, Amazon, eBay, some of the other ones, where you go onto your browser, you pull it up, you shop, you can take a look at what's out there. But mobile-only marketplaces are kind of a new thing where if you go to their site, all they do is direct you and tell you to download the app. So all of the shopping is done right from your mobile device. So from a brand owner's perspective or a vendor's perspective, it can make it a bit of a challenge to try to figure out, what exactly is happening on those mobile devices and on those apps, because it's a totally different infrastructure than traditional e-commerce. So Mercari is it's very similar to some of the other e-commerce sites, but it's all done again on your mobile device. So you can snap a photo. So if you want to sell something on there, it's as easy as taking out your mobile phone, taking a picture of whatever you want to sell, and posting it. You can post listings on there. So it moves very quickly rather than having to take a photo, upload it, create a listing or create an ad. You can do it all right from your mobile device and right on the go. And then you can rate sellers. So much like some of the more traditional e-commerce sites, you have the ability to go out there and rate sellers. So while it's a departure from traditional e-commerce, it has a lot of the same underpinnings in the way that you post listings, the way that you rate sellers, and the way that you shop. So with people always having their mobile devices on them, it's not something that consumers have to relearn. So while it's new that it's happening on their mobile device, it's not something that consumers have to feel or become comfortable with, so it's taken off. The second one is going to be chat apps. So one of the most popular ones or the most popular one, if I had to guess, is WhatsApp. So over 1 billion users. So the idea of WhatsApp being an emerging trend with 1 billion users is something that is interesting, but really what we wanted to focus on from the emerging trend is not WhatsApp in itself, but how people are using WhatsApp to target consumers. So really one of the ones that we've seen a lot lately is this direct marketing. So they're targeting the ever mobile user. So anyone that has WhatsApp, if they have certain links or they're engaged in certain conversations, businesses are figuring out how to target those consumers directly. So if we're talking about, potential bad actors or infringers, if they can pick up on those trends, they can circumvent all of the traditional ways of reaching out to someone to get them to buy a potentially counterfeit product, for example. So they can reach out directly to that consumer. They can post, a potential listing directly to them right on their mobile device. So it's kind of a new challenge to be aware of. And then e-commerce sales. So groups can be created and joined for specific campaigns. Really what that means is that if a bad actor or someone were to put something infringing, they can create a specific group, much like on Facebook, where if you've seen private groups that have to be invite only, they can do that right from their mobile devices, and people that are looking for those products can join those groups. Again, a lot of that is outside the purview of the brand owner, which makes it a bit of a challenge and something to certainly be aware of. And then industry and location targeting. Really what that means is they can target people by industry, of course. So they can drill down very specifically. So if you take something, that's wide open, like let's say apparel, for example, they can drill down from apparel to luxury goods, certain types of luxury goods to certain types of apparel, and target those consumers. And then location targeting. So if a brand or a particular type of product is very popular in a certain location, they can target the people in that location to try and drive those potentially infringing sales. And then the deep web and the dark web. So this is a pretty wide-ranging topic on its own, but it has started to show up, more and more in mainstream media. It's something that we are certainly here having more and more conversations about. So if we were going to talk emerging trends, it was definitely one we wanted to highlight. So it's a new emerging threat that companies should be aware of. So it's something that's out there. People know how to access it. People know kind of the idea of the deep web and the dark web is not the strange or unknown entity that it once was. One of the challenges is it's challenging to monitor and enforce. The dark web especially is set up to be anonymous. It's set up for people to hide within the deep web and to be able to conduct whatever business they're trying to without anyone finding out. There's certainly, there are vendors that are out there that are, able to or starting to be able to monitor, some parts of it, but it's certainly a challenge, the monitoring. The enforcing part is also a challenge. Unfortunately, in the dark web where it's set up to be anonymous, you don't have a good program for enforcement like you might on some of the more established marketplaces. So the enforcement pieces can also be a challenge. One of the upsides, though, is there's a high barrier of entry on the technology piece. So if you are talking about someone who is looking for a legitimate product, hopefully, or if someone unfortunately decides that they want to buy an infringing product, a lot of that is what we try to deal with kind of in the day-to-day. It's not often, or it's more challenging for people to go into the dark web because there is those technology barriers. There's special software that you have to download. There's special sites that you have to find. There's just a lot more work that goes into being able to look for products and look for things on the dark web. So for now, we've still got that high barrier of entry, which certainly is good, that it limits some of the general availability that might be out there for some of those other products. And lastly, it shouldn't be ignored. It's something that there is more and more conversations around. Depending on your industry, you might have already had issues, or you might already be looking into monitoring the dark web and the deep web. So really what we wanted to do is just bring this to mind, let people know that it's out there, and that it shouldn't be ignored. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nancy, and she's going to go through some alternative options that you might not have thought of when it comes to enforcing, and some different best practices that we've thought of and come up with. So thanks, Nancy.
Thanks, Zach. Yeah, so let's spend a few minutes to review and highlight some alternative options and some best practices that hopefully can help with the success of your brand protection program. So in terms of alternative options, I'm sure most of you on the call are familiar with the standard enforcement process as it relates to IP infringement, particularly on the legacy marketplaces that we've called out a few times, the Amazons and eBays and Alibabas of the world. Most of them have pretty established processes that, for the most part, work well, maybe in some cases not so much. But we've also experienced that we've been able to have some success with enforcing through some other means that are not necessarily IP related. and that's in the space of prohibited items and terms and conditions. So we'll take a look at the list of prohibited items, and it's typically unique by site, sometimes even unique by country or locale, and the terms and conditions, and see if we can find any other violation that we can utilize to get infringing listings down. So typically the process for submitting these might be a little bit different. There's usually a different email address, or in a lot of cases you actually have to report on the site itself through the individual listing. So unfortunately it's oftentimes a little bit more of a manual process, but we find that the compliance is often quite high. So some examples of some of those things would be like expired products, if you have something that has a shelf life, products that have seals that have been removed or tampered with, certain medical devices or limitations with things like cosmetics, those types of skincare, consumer products, supplements, that type of thing. And then there are even rules a lot of sites have around coupons and the reselling and use of coupons. You can usually find a comprehensive list of those prohibited items in terms of service within each individual platform's website. And again, be sure that you look by locale, because sometimes the policies will differ and you might have more availability of options in some countries than you would in others. Beyond that, other alternative options, of course, are payment processors. Most of the big payment processors do have a process for submitting a violation, and this doesn't necessarily just apply to marketplaces either. Typically, like for things like counterfeit websites or other things, you can submit to the payment processor to be removed as well. It's just kind of an added escalation. And then other than that, just, don't be shy about reaching out to the marketplaces and talking to them about your specific brand needs, products, and your business concerns. A lot of the marketplaces do have people in place that are meant to be working directly with brand owners. And again, while we know some are maybe not as collaborative as others, there are a lot that are collaborative and really want to engage in those conversations, but they may not necessarily be the ones proactively reaching out. So in our experience, we've worked with many of the marketplace platforms that, understand that they can't possibly know every brand's, nuances of their different products and what those prohibited items might be, or what the different rules or keywords, any of that stuff. But they're more than welcome to take that information from you to get better educated. I know some brands have even gone on site to some of these marketplace platforms and done training for the teams that are doing the review of the products and removing them. So don't be afraid to reach out and be proactive in that sense to see if you can, have some more success and kind of get your brand in the forefront of their minds. So let's just highlight a few special programs, and this certainly is not a comprehensive list, and some of these programs, of course, certainly are not new, although a lot of them aren't necessarily widely publicized, and then some are really new and are being talked about a lot right now. So as an example, iOffer, of course, has their COPS program. iOffer may not be a big issue for a lot of brands. It still is for some. But essentially, their compliance is typically pretty high, but they don't provide a lot of seller info unless you are a member of this program. It doesn't cost anything to participate, but you have to proactively sign up and submit some information in advance in order to utilize it. And it allows brand owners to actually suspend sellers that have been enforced upon within, a certain number of times in a certain time period. And then it also gives you the location information of those sellers without having to do any separate request or ask for it. And then, of course, the Good Faith Takedown program that Taobao Alibaba launched a couple of years ago that many, I'm sure, are familiar with. And coming out of that now, the latest thing is the IP Joint Force program. We're still in the process of gathering some information about that. It's been released at pretty limited availability. And actually, only members of the Good Faith Takedown program can participate in the IP Joint Force. So this was launched right at the beginning of July. They are now starting to expand their invites out to other brands. Some of you may have received those invites, and we'll be sharing more information on that as it comes down. But essentially, it's Alibaba's response to trying to be a little more proactive in cleaning up some of the infringements that are online, in looking at the machine learning and the submissions that brands have already put through the Good Faith Takedown and the history of sellers and listings, and then proactively sending them to the brand owners, where you can essentially just check a box and say yes or no, it's infringing or not, and you can do it in a group. And in addition to that, you don't have to provide any additional information as to why it might be counterfeit or why it might be violating. And then lastly on that, just industry associations. There are a lot of great associations out there that also have special relationships with some of these platforms, and oftentimes will have MOUs, and you can leverage those relationships to help expedite your processes of your claims, hopefully increase your compliance as well. And just one last thing on special programs, we're really focused on marketplaces for this particular webinar, but just note that those types of programs exist across a lot of platforms. YouTube has a trusted flagger program that, again, they don't really publicize widely, but it is available for copyright takedowns that go much, much faster than the typical process. GoDaddy has a VIP program for websites that are hosted by GoDaddy, and you can often get masked who-is information released and things like that based on some trademark stuff. So always good to take a look at what other added value options are available. So let's go over just some quick best practices. One big one that Zach and I were talking about recently was about knowing your other names. So in looking across these emerging markets and regions, particularly those that have their own local language or various languages, we've learned over time that a lot of the trademark terms, what it might be here in the U.S. or in English, are totally different in other countries. And it's not exactly a one-to-one ratio of how it crosses over or what a symbol means. So do some investigation on that in terms of knowing what the iterations of your trademark and your names are, so that you can make sure that you're accessing all of that data and able to enforce appropriately. And then looking at region-specific representation, making sure that you have folks or that your service providers have folks in those local areas that speak languages that can communicate with the platforms and navigate kind of the different nuances of all those different cultures. They do handle things differently. Their IP rules are certainly different. And it definitely does help to have some kind of, at least an understanding of those different cultural nuances to be able to help you navigate that process. And then lastly, to investigate your investigators. So you want to make sure that you have good referrals in terms of the folks that are doing your on-the-ground investigation, that they're providing all of the appropriate backup and follow-up and information in terms of what they're doing for you. So I think there are a lot of really good trusted investigators out there. But just like in anything else, right, there are a few that don't provide all the information. You want to make sure that you're getting everything that you're paying for in that realm. So one last thing before we get to questions is, after all of this, what can you do next? So I think we talked about, finding those alternatives. Research the platforms thoroughly, or again, leverage your service provider to identify all those different value-add programs and options, and look at any alternative way that you can to get those infringements removed. Leverage those relationships that you have, or start building those relationships with the marketplaces directly or with your service provider to see if you can utilize a more collaborative approach. Again, there will always be some that aren't willing to engage, but I think more often than not, many are and are wanting to be more proactive. And as more and more information is kind of being released and focused in the press from a negative standpoint, I think they're really wanting to kind of clean up their reputations in a lot of ways. And we can certainly, and you can certainly help them do that. And then be a guinea pig. Volunteer to beta test new platforms. We've noticed in the last year or so that a few of the marketplaces that we work with have kind of changed their process or updated their process. They might have had kind of an older, more archaic way of submitting. Maybe it was just simply an email notification. So a lot of them are building out and adapting new forms that are requiring a lot more level of detail, or even an entire platform system like an Alibaba that you have to log into, submit your trademark, submit all of your information, and then process your claims. And we're seeing quite a few that are following that path and then kind of using Alibaba as the model. So as that continues forward, use those relationships again. It's such an important piece, the relationships that you have in working with them and making sure that they know who you are and they know your brands, so that you can volunteer to beta test those. Tell them that you're willing to test out those new platforms and give your feedback and provide information on what works and what doesn't, and how it can, help brand owners in some sense in terms of processing, and how ultimately it can help them as well. And then enforce early and enforce often. So we talked about all those emerging markets and those trends with mobile only, with Africa, with Russia. Try to get ahead of those things as much as you can. Research them now. Don't wait until the problem is so big that it takes a lot of time and resource to wrap your arms around and to get after it. Even if you see only a few online infringements in some of those emerging markets, best to start enforcing on those now, getting a handle on what the process is before it gets completely out of hand. Because as we've seen, there's so much potential for growth, given that penetration and population in some of those spots, that it won't take much for it to really just kind of exponentially increase, and then pretty soon you've got thousands of products being offered in those markets. I think if you start attacking it early, you can get ahead of that and hopefully make your brand a hard target. So that's, I think, all we've got. Time for some questions if anybody has them.
Yeah, we did have some questions come in. So the first one is, how is MarkMonitor handling harvesting and enforcing on marketplaces only accessible via mobile apps to handle the high mobile penetration in Africa?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And so, currently, I think with our current technology, we do have a mobile app solution that is really touching on some of the larger providers. And so if it's with those emerging, how do I want to put this? So with things that are emerging, technology is always going to evolve with it. And so what we're looking at right now is trying to figure out how we can leverage some of the relationships that Nancy talked about, and how we can leverage some of the new technology that we have coming out. That I don't want to get too far ahead into some of this cool new stuff that we have coming out. But, we've got some new technology, we've got some really smart folks, and then I think the biggest piece of it is the awareness. So we've done a lot of good research. We've looked into these various places and said, okay, this is what's coming up next, and like Nancy said, you got to be ahead of it. So we've got some new technology and some new things coming out, but it's certainly a challenge. I'm not going to say that, we've got a silver bullet to figure out the mobile marketplaces solution in Africa. I mean, it's kind of a hard thing to pin down. But it is something that MarkMonitor is aware of, and something that we're trying to build. And then we've got a few relationships that we're trying to leverage as well. Nancy, anything to add on to that one?
Yeah, no, I would agree. Zac, it definitely is a challenge, and one that we're very much aware of, and kind of looking at how we can pull in that mobile data. Right now in the interim, I think we're looking at, if we know the mobile data is out there, we've even had kind of just like phones that we buy just for the purpose of the company that we can use that don't belong to anyone personally to try to get that data. It's a little bit clunky, obviously. We'd prefer just to come right into the software system, but again, it's sort of a stopgap to be able to look at that data. And we have done some outreach on a couple of those mobile-only marketplaces already, and we can submit notices via email. So again, it's like pulling some in through data, but then sending an email of what those infringements are. But we're hoping to get to a point where the technology will solve a lot of that for us and be able to harvest that in and send it through as well. But certainly some things to be worked out there.
Okay, great. So another question that came in, when it comes to delisting counterfeit products across global marketplaces, is it possible to get seller info, to track down bad actors, to conduct a physical investigation or raids? Can MarkMonitor help in such situations?
Yes and no. So just to be fair, I mean, it really depends on the platform and the platform's rules, right? So, eBay is typically pretty good about sharing seller information as it relates to counterfeit goods, as long as there's been an enforcement and we can get that locale information. We talked a little bit earlier about iOffer and the COPS program. They will share seller location information as long as you're signed up for that program. I believe Alibaba and that system are starting to share more seller information, depending. Amazon, not so much. So again, it's completely by platform. We certainly will harvest that information from anyone that does provide it, and we can kind of aggregate that and show you, who the big sellers are, who the big players are. If you want to do an on-the-ground investigation, we absolutely can help you with that. And that's certainly one thing that from like a policy sort of thought, leadership side that we are trying to influence with our presence in the space and those relationships that we're building is, trying to influence some of those big players in making that information more readily available to brand owners. And I think your industry associations can, also will be helping with that.
Okay, thank you. Another question that came in, do the special programs offered by some e-commerce sites include certain obligations on the brand owner, for example, to allow the site owner to use the brand for their own promotional purposes?
Not that I have ever seen. So typically it's just a matter of knowing what those programs are that are available and being able to get signed up. But I haven't, thus far, in any of those that we discussed, seen where the marketplace wants to utilize that brand name as like a partnership or a call out or a promotional opportunity.
Okay. Another question is, I know that WhatsApp is owned by Facebook. Is there anything that can be leveraged there, or can you talk more about their relationship?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you're absolutely right. So there's a couple things there that I think are interesting, especially when it comes to WhatsApp. So WhatsApp on its own has its own terms and conditions, much like any of the other marketplaces that we chatted about. They've got their own terms and conditions, so if you're on there, if you do, happen to get a message that's got any infringing content on it, WhatsApp does have its own terms and conditions, so that's great. So kind of the big point to drive home here is that because they have that relationship with Facebook, they're further along in kind of the maturity of their program when it comes to dealing with enforcement. Some of these others that we've chatted about, whether it's a mobile-only marketplace or whether it's a chat app, some of those that are emerging, it's not something that they've really thought about. Most of them do have an email address that you can reach out to, but with WhatsApp, because of their relationship with Facebook and the work that Facebook does in removing infringing items, they're further along. So they've certainly got terms and conditions. They've certainly got folks you can reach out to if you do happen to get some of those, if you do happen to see anything infringing. So I would say that relationship between WhatsApp and Facebook is definitely a good thing because it's helped them be more responsive as they've got that huge footprint. I mean, 1 billion users is a ton. So it's good that they've been able to kind of leverage that relationship with Facebook and to set up their own terms and conditions that are worthwhile. So thanks.
Great, thanks, Zach. Another question, is Yandex an available marketplace to harvest results and enforce upon via the Mark Monitor marketplace portal?
It is not currently being harvested through the portal, but it is most definitely on the roadmap. As Zach kind of alluded to some of the new technology that we're working on and some of the upgrades, it is extremely high on the list. Russia in general is high on the list. There's another big marketplace there called Avito as well that we are looking at to be adding in the near future for coverage. So be on the lookout for that. As soon as it's ready, certainly you all will be the first to know.
Yeah, and I will say in terms of the roadmap and what's coming up for technology in the future, just to do a little plug, for those of you who are customers, we do have our forum coming up next month, and we're going to be discussing a lot of that and more emerging trends. So if you want to learn a little bit more about that, you can reach out to me after the webinar, and I can send you some information. All right, so another question is, with so many new regions and marketplaces, what's the best to know, what to pay attention to?
I think just, kind of, as we've already iterated, is just paying attention to all those emerging markets. And it's difficult sometimes because there are so many and there's so much information. Hopefully a little bit of what we've shared today has kind of started that thought process. But there are definitely some others to take a look at. And there are so many new marketplaces starting all the time, and it's difficult to know which ones are really going to take off and which ones aren't. So I think just in terms of your own products, looking at what regions you have the most concern with, particularly any channel issues or weaknesses that you might have, just anywhere you're trying to kind of get a handle on. But looking early at those marketplaces, some of the ones that we listed, I would say go out and take a look at those now, see if your products are there. And again, that's certainly something that we can help with, and kind of doing a general landscape overview of here's where we're seeing your stuff right now. And it's certainly something we could do, on an occasional basis to kind of check in, say quarterly or, bi-yearly of like, okay, here's what it looked like 6 months ago. Now we're seeing an uptick in this particular region.
Yeah, that's good, Nancy. And then just to add kind of one more little part onto that, so it is a challenge. Like Nancy alluded to, that there are so many different marketplaces that are emerging, and as everyone well knows, there's kind of finite resources. So one of the best practices that we've developed here that is kind of fed this webinar and fed some of our other best practices, is looking kind of internally at your own business and then externally at web traffic. So what we like to do if we're looking at evolving regions, let's say we're looking at, at Russia and we're talking Yandex and Avito, did I say that?
Yes.
Avito. So what we try to do is leverage all sorts of free internet tools and things that we have, in-house to look at web traffic. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we are monitoring or at least aware of all of the big players in all of the regions. So some of that really just comes down to, looking at the web traffic, trying to identify the trends, who are the big players in these particular areas. If you can cover the big players, you're doing yourself a huge favor if you know those particular marketplaces in those particular regions. The other part that we often find ourselves in conversation with different clients and different brands is internally. And so what I mean by that is really being in tuned to what your customer service folks are saying, what people are saying online, if you do have kind of a complaint form or a message board or some sort of way for customers to reach out to you. If you're really in tune with those messaging, what we've seen is that people are able to quickly identify certain regions where they might see, for example, a spike in customer complaints. Maybe it's counterfeit product, maybe it's something different. But if you're really in tune to what the customers are saying, and you're also in tune to where the emerging trends are via web traffic and other research, you can really go a long way in helping yourself out if you can kind of take those two and combine them as part of your overall brand protection strategy.
Right. So another question, do you consider South America as an emerging market, and would you highlight any specific countries?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think South America definitely fits into that category. I'm not sure, Nancy, if there's a specific country that comes to mind. I know we deal with Mercado Libre always pops into my head, maybe through your relationship work you have, some.
Yeah, I think, we're seeing some growth there. I don't know if it's maybe as big as what we're looking at in some of the other countries. But Mercado Libre has kind of always been the big, in terms of marketplace player in that space. They've sort of owned that region because they cover so many different countries in Latin America, South America. But we are seeing some other kind of independent marketplaces pop up, even in like Mexico and some of those others that we're looking at as well. So I don't know if I'd say emerging maybe necessarily, but definitely growing and one that you want to keep an eye on.
And, certainly within the confined kind of 1 hour space of a webinar, it's tough to touch on, all of the different things that we're currently looking at. So I'm not sure who asked that question, but, if you have with your particular brand or, in your particular space, if there is something in that region that is of a concern to you or something that has been brought to your attention, whatever it might be, we're glad to follow up with you after this webinar and see if there's some additional research we can do on our end to help you out, or if there's a way to shore up maybe some additional questions that you have, because it can be tough to touch on the whole globe in an hour, but we're glad to follow up and help out.
Okay, so next question, what is the most effective way you've found to go about building relationships?
I guess I'll take that on. Honestly, I say all the time, because it is, that really is my role on a day-to-day basis, but it's really not rocket science, right? So we're all kind of in this game, if you will, together, and granted, it feels a little bit, I think, like a lot of an us and them scenario when you're dealing with marketplaces, because we're submitting all the things that are infringing. They're trying to make money off the sales of goods on their platform, but they also kind of have some, negative press around the counterfeit goods in particular and some of the other violations. But to be perfectly honest, in my experience, I have found that just doing that really proactive outreach and being relentless in doing so can really pay off, and sometimes you have to be patient. Again, the marketplaces that have been around for a while, that are well established, they have people in place that are there and designated to work directly with brands. And if you don't know who those folks are, then please reach out to us and we can help get you connected, either through our relationships or directly. We're happy to do that. And a lot of times, though, it's just about digging and finding those people. And sometimes it literally is almost just like a sales call. In my experience, it's a cold call to reach out and say, hey, here's who we are. Can you help? And surprisingly, or maybe not, we get a lot of response out of that. And just trying to understand, approaching it from a, hey, it's not, you're doing this wrong, fix this problem for us, even if that's truly how you feel, but more of a, that collaborative approach of like, look, here's what we're trying to do. We really are trying to help them as well, keep it as clean as possible. We know it's never going to be perfect, but if they would, help us understand the process better, make sure we're submitting things correctly, I've found that really goes a long way.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one more question. With the deep web, the deep dark web emerging, what should I be doing about it?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I'm not sure again that there's a silver bullet answer to, but I think that there's some best practices with something that's so new and so emerging. One, as I mentioned, is you have to be aware of it. Whether what percentage that takes up of your overall brand protection, strategy is to be determined probably with what types of products you have and what industry you're in. But it's not going to do you any good to simply ignore that entire space and to be unaware of it. Because if something does happen in the dark web, it's going to, it could have a huge impact on your customers and depending on industry. The other thing that you can do, and again, I'll follow up Gina's plug with another one if you happen to, if you're one of our customers, that we do have, some new technology, and Nancy has done a fantastic job at leveraging some relationships with some folks who have, some expertise in monitoring that space that we have been working with. So, really there's two things that I would really recommend. One, be aware of it, and two, to make sure that, once you are aware, if you have someone internally that can go and check the space out, or, if it's something that you're concerned about, we'd be glad to help with that as well. So just make sure that you're aware, make sure you have, as best as possible, kind of a grasp on the understanding of deep web, dark web, and what that means to your brand for potential infringements.
Right. Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Nancy. We appreciate you sharing those best practices with the audience today. I'd also like to thank everyone tuning in for your participation. We had so many great questions come in, and I know that really helped draw out some additional information for everyone listening. And so as a reminder, we'll be sending out a follow-up email with a link to the webinar's presentation slides and the recording within the next couple of days. So you can be on the lookout for that email. That concludes our webinar for today. Thanks again for tuning in, and have a great day, everyone.